Today is an announcement of the decision that I have to make as prosecuting attorney for the officer-involved shooting that occurred in Bentonville in the early morning hours of Sunday, January the 10th. By the letter I've outlined today, that shooting was justified under Arkansas law, and so I have released that today, as well as the body cam evidence that I relied on in reaching that conclusion. I would point out that there are still some things left to do with toxicology and state police officers being able to complete drafting of their reports, but we didn't feel like it was the right thing to delay for all that to happen. That may be a few more weeks since the body camera footage itself is dispositive that it was a lawful shooting. So that's why we're going ahead to make the announcement today, hopefully to benefit not only the officers but as well as the family of Mr. Williams, and kind of putting this behind them.
When you say it's a lawful shooting, can you just add on to that?
Well, in the state of Arkansas, officers are allowed to use deadly physical force, specifically in this case if they believe that there is a risk of imminent deadly force being used against them. In this case, the facts as outlined by the state police are clear that in the early morning hours of January the 10th, Mr. Williams' wife, the younger Mrs. Williams, and by the way, during this, everybody's Williams. So in the letter I use senior just because it's easier to say. The senior and junior, they do not have the same name, but the senior just refers to the father of the deceased, all right? So Mrs. Williams, the wife of the decedent, reached out to her in-laws, the parents of Mr. Brian Williams, who was eventually shot by police. And she was concerned that he was behaving in an erratic manner, that his mental state had deteriorated. When Mr. Brian Williams' parents arrived in those early morning hours, he had an altercation with both his mother and his father, and caused injuries to his father that ultimately resulted in his hospitalization that same night. After that occurred, Mr. Brian Williams' mother reached out to the police. She called 911, and officers responded. When they got there, they found the elder Mr. Williams, the father of Mr. Brian Williams, seated on the front porch, clearly very injured and still trying to regain his senses. Officers spoke to both he and his wife, the elder Mrs. Williams, and during the conversations with them, they learned that the family had become concerned about Mr. Brian Williams in the weeks leading up to this, had even taken the steps of taking his guns out of his house. I think he had some job changes or something like that. And so Mrs. Williams, the elder Mrs. Williams, not the wife, but the mother of the decedent, informed the police that though he didn't have guns, he did have knives, and that she was concerned about the safety of her daughter-in-law and her grandchildren. She told the officers that she was so concerned that she gave them the door code to the front door and was encouraging them to hurry up. She even said at one point that if you aren't hearing anything from inside, I'm concerned something already may have happened. So clearly that created for the officers what's called an exigent circumstance, meaning they can enter the house without a warrant. In this case, if they believe that Mr. Brian Williams would be a danger to himself or others, in this case, his wife and his children. So after knocking and announcing themselves on the doors and windows of the home for about 12 minutes, trying to get him to come out, officers could see, and you'll notice on the body cam, they could see Mr. Brian Williams kind of crouched behind the island in his home. They did see he had knives out. After 12 minutes of trying to get him to come out, they punched the door code into the front door, and they cracked the door open. They didn't make an entry at that point. The door was actually barricaded with a couch. So they shoved the door open enough to where they could yell in to Mr. Brian Williams to come out. At that point, officers did not enter the house. They actually backed out and were still on the porch, didn't enter the house. Mr. Brian Williams essentially charged out of his home holding a knife in his hand. And there were 3 officers, Sergeant Brent Farr, Officers Kyle Putnam, and Officer Tyler Sharp, along with a couple other officers, were on the porch. And it all happens very fast. Mr. Brian Williams charged out, and the 3 officers on the porch fired at him with their service weapons, hitting him, we believe, 10 times, and he died of his injuries. The body camera clearly shows that he was holding a knife, and officers, had they not responded, certainly would have been stabbed by Mr. Brian Williams. And one other thing I would point out too, I've spoken with the family of Mr. Williams, and they were very keen for it to be known that this behavior was certainly out of character for Mr. Williams, that they believe his mental state had degraded in the hours leading up to this happening, and wanted it to be known that they believed he was a good man and a good father, and this was just a tragic thing that occurred.
And you mentioned waiting on toxicology
Right.
report, so was there any reason to believe that he was under the influence of anything?
We don't have any direct reason to believe. Obviously, when you see a person act out of character like this, there's suspicion whether it's a mental issue, mental health issue, maybe it's a substance abuse issue, we simply don't know, so that's kind of standard practice on that.
Do we know the injuries of the grandfather or anyone else that was in the house?
Yeah, I believe that the grandfather of the children is out of the hospital. He will recover, but he was injured significantly enough in a physical altercation with his son that he had to go to the hospital.
And he's recovered now.
I believe so, yes.
With the rest of the family, no injuries to the rest of it?
Yes, and thankfully after the officers shot Mr. Brian Williams, they immediately entered the home and found his wife and children unharmed. And they informed police that earlier in the evening, Mr. Brian Williams had ordered them to stay in the laundry room and not come out, so that's where they had been through this altercation.
I also know Bentonville police just recently got the body cameras, correct?
Right.
Do we know how long ago it was a few weeks ago?
They've had some body cameras for a few years. I don't know how widely used they have been, but certainly I think this case is a great example of how useful body camera evidence is. It's not perfect. It doesn't all work in every situation, but one of the reasons here we're able to clear this shooting so quickly, even as we're waiting for these other things, is from a legal perspective, the body camera evidence is dispositive. It tells the tale, so to speak.
Would you recommend other departments to get body cameras?
Sure. Well, yes, I would. I think it's great for law enforcement to have body camera evidence. I realize it's easier for me to say that than it is for people to pay for that. And clearly, not every department has the resources and the ability to store all that information. So that's going to be a process. But as a prosecuting attorney, I like body camera evidence. I think it eliminates any points of confusion when it actually shows the event, and in this case, it does.
You mentioned you thought he was hit 10 times. Do we know how many shots were fired, and is that standard procedure for that many cops to shoot that much?
Well, I think it's standard procedure that when you've got multiple police officers facing a man charging them with a knife, they're going to take their guns out and shoot. And obviously, officers can shoot multiple rounds in just a moment. I mean, you'll see when you see the body camera evidence and yes, these were the only 3 officers that shot, but you'll see when you see the body camera evidence how fast it happens. I mean, it's over almost as soon as it begins. So no, that is not uncommon.
And you said officers, when we talked previously that officers rendered aid, is that something that's visible in the body camera?
Yes, you can see that after the officers have engaged after they've shot Mr. Williams, they immediately begin applying CPR, first aid, getting medic equipment from their vehicles as they're supposed to do. So I think it's unmistakable that in this shooting, as well as any other shooting, no police officer wants to have to kill a person. Especially a man that's married with children. It's a terrible, tragic thing that occurred, and yet they were faced with a situation where there was no other outcome than to shoot in their own self-defense, and they did that here. They then did everything they could do to try to save him, but ultimately he died of his injuries.
Are they still on administrative leave?
I think that's a question for Chief Simpson. I believe that as far as the law is concerned, there's no reason for them to be on administrative leave anymore, but that's ultimately a question for the Bentonville Police Department. That's not, certainly my decision of when they bring them back.
When you say police, when they first arrived on scene, they met up with Mr. and Senior.
Mrs. Williams, yeah.
That was outside of Junior Williams' home?
Right.
Okay.
So Mr. Brian Williams is still in his house, and then his mother is in her vehicle, which is obviously parked outside of the home. And so officers go up and start communicating with her and getting information about what had happened that night. And so she was the one who informed them about the events that had occurred, the erratic behavior he had been exhibiting, as well as the fact that he had knives in the house and she believed he was dangerous. Officers were able to see inside that he had knives as well. And then obviously, he can be seen on the body camera coming out with a knife in his hand.
And no police record for Mr. Williams Jr.?
I'm not aware of any criminal history for Mr. Williams at this time.
You guys good?
Anybody else?